Dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Université Libre de Bruxelles. I'm delighted to see so many of you here this evening for the keynote lecture of Professor Daniel Kelman entitled Will Europe Escape its Autocracy Trap? My name is Ramona Coman. I'm a professor of political science here at the ULB and the academic coordinator of the Horizon Europe Red Spinel research project. Now for the audience, Red Spinel, for the third time this day, I have to say, Red Spinel is a project which is financed by the European Union, a project which examines the census of liberal democracy, and it is a project coordinated by this university involving 7 academic partners and 4 non-academic partners from EU and non-EU member states. And together we try to understand how have EU institutional actors responded to increase the census of liberal democracy, and what are the implications of the census of liberal democracy for the EU's capacity to act. This evening we are addressing, I think, an important topic for us as academics, but also as citizens. And it is not in this audience that I have to remind that the EU has faced for years now a profound crisis of the rule of law in its member states. Not only has the rule of law been dismantled, but also rights have been contested and under strain. In response, EU institutions have slowly developed what is called in EU jargon the EU's rule of law toolbox, which is a set of policy instruments designed to serve different purposes. Some of them, such as the EU Justice Scoreboard, allows the Commission to monitor the states and the functioning of national justice systems, while others, like the European semester or the annual rule of law report, allow the Commission to provide recommendations to strengthen the efficiency, quality, and independence of the justice system in all EU member states. Through these instruments, the Commission shapes, I would say, the national agenda of reforms in dialogue with the member states. This is important, while other instruments have been designed to deal with systemic threats to the rule of law, and here I'm speaking about the rule of law framework. While the first measures undermining the rule of law were adopted by the Hungarian Fidesz party in 2010, it took, as you know, the European Parliament more than 8 years to trigger Article 7 in 2018 against Hungary, and it took 2 years to the European Commission to do the same, trigger Article 7 against Poland in 2017, after 2 years of dialogue with the Law and Justice Polish government. The issue has been, as we know, divisive within institutions, between institutions, and in addition to what the instruments that I've just mentioned, a complex regime of spending conditionality has been put in place to protect the EU budget in cases when breaches of the rule of law principle affect or risk affecting the EU financial interest, but also to ensure the respect of the Charter of Fundamental Rights in the implementation, for example, of cohesion policy, and also as part of the implementation of the EU's Recovery and Resilience Facility. Article 7, which makes the headlines, is currently at a standstill, despite the organization of 6 hearings with Poland and Hungary by the various presidencies of the Council and several states of the place, as it is called in EU Council jargon. Often considered wrongly as a nuclear option, Article 7 has turned into a talking show. This is an expression that we use in academia. And as a result, social and political actors, not only in Poland and Hungary, but also in other member states, are deploring that little has been achieved on the ground, and that the process of de-Europeanization or even autocratization has accelerated in some contexts. Much has been written in the academia and in the public sphere about the nature of those policy instruments, and even more on the very limited impact on the ground. Professor Daniel Kelman is one of the academics who has contributed most to the debates on understanding the politics of the rule of law crisis. His work makes a major contribution to our Red Spinel research agenda, so it was, I would say, natural to invite you this evening, Professor Kelman, to open our annual conference of our Red Spinel project. I know that Professor Kelman is known in this audience, but allow me to say that he is a McCourt Chair at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University, and also Professor of Law at Georgetown Law. His research interest includes the politics and law of the European Union, comparative politics and law, and comparative public policy. I've mentioned just one book. To be brief, Eurolegalism, the Transformation of Law and Regulation in the European Union, published with Harvard University Press, which received in 2011, which won in 2011 the Best Book Award from the European Union Studies Association. The topic of this evening has been very recently published in the European Journal of European Public Policy. And in this very important article, Professor Kelemen responded to a set of questions which are of a great importance for us and for our project. Why did the EU fail to act robustly to address the rise of increasingly autocratic member states? Why has the EU become more assertive since last year? And above all, will the EU escape its autocracy trap? Which is the topic of his public lecture this evening. Thank you very much, Professor Kelemen, for accepting our invitation, and welcome to the ULB. I'll give you now the floor for 40 minutes, and I look forward to the discussions and the questions that we will have with the audience at the end of those. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Professor Komen, for the invitation, for the kind introduction, and for having me here at the ULB. And thanks to all of you for coming. Great, we found some more chairs. Being here brings back a lot of memories, because actually when I was a graduate student writing my PhD and first came over from California to Brussels to study this thing called the EU, I lived about 500 meters from where we're giving this lecture. So it's nice to be back in the neighborhood. And like a lot of things when we look back in life, I won't tell you how long ago that was. You would think I was very old, but you kind of look back and you think, oh, could I have imagined this then? And I certainly could never have imagined that I'd be giving a talk on this topic, right? That was the 1990s, and a few years before that, I had been living in Hungary, watching the change in the system, and that led me to studying the EU, because back in those heady days, we were countries in East Central Europe were aspiring to join the EU one day, and that's what got me personally interested in studying the EU. But of course, we never could have imagined that we'd be facing questions of sort of democratic backsliding or autocratization. I think naively, we thought that once democracy was consolidated in the region, it was sort of done, and once states were in the EU, then you could tick off that box. Okay, well now democracy's sorted because they're in the EU. So we could have never imagined, this topic, but yet here we are. So, as Ramona said, the topic today is will the EU escape its autocracy trap? And just to give you a little background, for those who don't know any of my work, a few years back, 4 years ago, I published an article in the same Journal of European Public Policy, on this idea that the EU was trapped in a kind of authoritarian equilibrium, or I also called it there an autocracy trap. And so basically this new article that my talk today is based on, which just came out last week, is kind of revisiting things 4 years later, saying, well, what's changed, what hasn't? Can the EU escape this trap, or is it stuck? And I don't know, thinking about being in traps, it makes me think of Houdini, the escape artist. I don't know if that reference is just too ancient for people. They don't even know who Houdini is anymore, but he was a famous magician, escape artist who would design these elaborate things where he'd be buried and in a coffin or in water. It actually didn't work out for him eventually. He died also in one of his escapes. But yeah, the thing about these escapes, even though they're usually miraculous and very impressive, sometimes they don't work out, right? So trigger warning, when you're thinking about escapes, sometimes you get stuck. And there's a sad story in 1990. A magician tried to redo one of Houdini's things, and he suffocated under dirt in his box. So if you came here for an uplifting story, you may want to check out one of the other rooms down the hall. Maybe there's something more uplifting. But and I came to you, I teach in the States at Georgetown, and the US experience and the experience of many federal systems is not very encouraging in this regard, because what we can see is that in federal systems, often member states get stuck in these kind of autocracy traps. So in the US, we had autocratic state regimes at the state level for nearly 90 years after the Civil War. Right? The country, broadly speaking, was democratic at the federal level, and yet that country harbored single-party autocratic states for decades and decades. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that. I've talked about that in a lot of my previous work, but the point is just to emphasize that this is not a problem that necessarily solve itself quickly, right? And we have the example of many other systems that say this problem can go on for a long time if it isn't tackled. All right, so as Professor Coleman said, there's 3 questions that are the center of my paper that I'm going to talk about today. So talk's divided into kind of 3 parts. Why did the EU fail to respond robustly to the autocracy crisis or the increasing democratic backsliding, not just in Hungary, but in Poland as well, for more than a decade? Why did the EU become more assertive after around 2021? So 2022, 23 is really when we've seen more action. And does this recent shift of approach by EU institutions in getting tougher in defending democracy, plus the surprising outcome of the Polish election where a democratic pro-rule of law opposition has come to power, does this mean that we can be hopeful and optimistic that the EU may get out of this problem soon? And again, I guess the spoiler alert for the rest of the talk, I hope you'll stay for the whole time, but if you have to leave, the short answer is don't hold your breath, right? We're not getting out of this anytime soon. And it's not just because of Viktor Orban or his government. I think the problems, as we'll see, are more structural. All right, so part 1 of the talk. Why did the EU respond so meekly to democratic backsliding? And many scholars, and in the paper you'll see I cite all the literature. I made my own contributions. Many people in this room, you have a terrific book on the issue. Many scholars have identified numerous factors that played into this. I'll go over some, but if we take a step back, I just think the big picture takeaway is really the outcome of the EU responding weakly was what logicians or social scientists would say is overdetermined, right? And by that I mean there were multiple sets of sufficient conditions that would have led to this outcome. So really we shouldn't be surprised that it happened. We should rather, in retrospect, be surprised by our own naivete back in the 90s, that we didn't kind of foresee this or take steps, right? And why do I have a house on fire? I don't know, I'm often reminded, I promise not to give a philosophy lecture, but I always make my grad students read a paper from 1965, American Philosophical Review by the Oxford philosophy don J.L. Mackie, where it's called Of Causes and Conditions. And he opens the paper, talking about these ideas of things being overdetermined and how do we understand causation, with an example of a house that burns down. And maybe the inspector goes and sees, okay, this fire has broken out, house burned down, and they say, well, I think it was a faulty wire. But then, on further reflection, they say, well, it was a faulty wire, but it really wouldn't have burned down if there also wasn't an absence of a sprinkler system, if there also wasn't a lot of dry, flammable material everywhere. And so you go on and on, you see that the outcome was kind of overdetermined, that if it wasn't that one wire that was faulty, some other spark would have set it off, because the conditions were, so many conditions were there that were prone to this kind of outcome. So what were those conditions that kind of led us to this outcome? First one, the one I've written probably the most about myself, is party politics. This was part of why the EU failed to respond early on, in the early days when backsliding first started in Hungary, was party politics. Long story short, I won't go into it too much, is that Viktor Orban back in those days and his Fidesz party, okay, I have to make an admission. There's lots of Hungarians in the audience. I was once a volunteer for Fidesz back in, they were a liberal party then. It was like back in the 90s. Anyway, but they were a member of the EPP, which, as everyone here in Brussels knows, is the most powerful political party at the EU level. And being part of a Euro party provides you a certain amount of protection at the EU level. Just like, by the way, in that picture I showed you about the US, the Southern Democrats, who were the autocrats in the US, they got protection from the National Democratic Party to run their racist autocracies in the South. And similarly, aspiring autocrats in a member state level, they can get protection from a Euro party. But it's especially good if your protection comes from the most powerful Euro party and from the de facto leader of Europe, Angela Merkel, right? Who, of course, as leader of CDU, I mean, this is one of the big ironies. and you always shock American audiences. You won't be shocked when you say, well, remember how Merkel was the leader of the free world, right? And you point out, but yet she was the big defender of Orban in EU circles, and her CDU was key party defending them. So that, and Manfred Weber, this is hilarious because now he tries to style himself as this big critic of Orban and all that. But some of us remember, and we don't forgive, right? Because we remember when he went to Budapest and campaigned for Orban, right? And appeared at rallies and endorsed his re-election back when his elections were already being criticized by the OSCE and others. Anyway, so number one factor, party politics provided protection for backsliders. And by the way, later on in the story, peace gets some protection from the ECR, but less because the ECR is less powerful, especially after the Tories had left, everything. But anyway, party politics. Second factor, intergovernmental norms and institutions. This is a very strong factor. Why do I show you these pictures? These are just a bunch of pictures of EU leaders meeting in different council meetings over the year with Orban. You see a little smiling, a little glad handing. That before I even get to the institutions part, I just want to say there are very strong norms of non-intervention in sensitive domestic political affairs of other member states. Within EU institutions, there's this ingrained reluctance to speak out, directly criticize other leaders. Leaders in the council, they treat each other like a country club, right, of friends and diplomatic niceties, and you don't outwardly criticize. And the kind of norm is, I won't get too much into your business if you don't get too much into mine. Except, of course, if you're talking about the Eurozone crisis in Greece when they were perfectly happy to get into other people's business, but we'll put that aside. But generally, there are these strong norms. So that also really led to a reluctance to act. But it's not just those norms. It's also, and beyond the norms, it's also institutions. And I'll come back to the recent, veto threats and Ukraine. We'll talk about all that in a minute. But basically, in general, in the EU, compared to any other kind of federal type system, these member states that become increasingly autocratic, they of course might wield veto power in sensitive areas like the budget, foreign policy, right? So they can then use that to have added leverage to make their counterparts reluctant to intervene. So think about in the period of the 2010s when the backsliding was occurring, first in Hungary and then Poland, this was the age of crises in the EU. We had the Eurozone crisis, we had the refugee crisis, we had Brexit, right? And then later COVID, et cetera. But with all these crises, there was consistently a fear, if we crack down too hard on this issue, then they might undermine the necessary consensus we need to act on these crises. So in the name of preserving that kind of cooperative spirit, we can't get tough on these issues. So that's all in the shadow of this veto threat. And then the final kind of intergovernmental institutional feature that makes it hard to intervene or makes the EU reluctant is the structure of the EU gives these autocratic regimes. I think we must have violated fire safety rules here. I think that's where we're moving. No, it's all right. I do not want to be responsible for in a conflagration, for the death of most of the EU legal and political science scholars in Brussels here. So, okay, now there's safe exit. Anyway, there are unparalleled opportunities in the EU structure for these regimes to place their servants, so to speak, in EU institutions, because every member state gets a judge, right, on the Court of Justice, or now 2 judges on the General Court, right? Every member state gets a commissioner, et cetera, right? So you get to, and that allows these regimes then to put loyal servants of theirs in different positions of influence, which we'll come back to in a minute. So all of those things give the local autocrat more leverage and more power to infiltrate the center than in any other kind of federal or quasi-federal system. And we've seen this long before this latest round of threats in December and January. This sort of veto threat thing goes back. Remember 2020 with the MFF negotiations, right? There's been various other things in foreign policy where the Hungarian and or Polish regimes threatened vetoes saying, back off or else we'll veto, So you've got a very nice union there. It would be a real shame if something happened to it, right? Is the kind of threat they're posing. All right. And then, in terms of the placement of your servants, there's many examples of this, but none none more glaring than what happened when von der Leyen needed votes of Fidesz, and in fact also of PIS, even though they weren't in her party. She needed their votes to get her mandate as Commission president, and you have to give and receive in politics, right? And basically the quid pro quo with Orban was she made his guy, the Commissioner for Enlargement, a perch from which he has systematically tried to impede the EU from imposing firm rule of law conditions on candidate states like Serbia, et cetera, right? So how much credibility does EU enlargement have so long as a servant of Orban's is the enlargement commissioner, if we're serious, right? Okay. So that's the second factor, the intergovernmentalism. Third factor, something I've come to appreciate more since writing that article 4 or 5 years ago now, is something else I came across in my work with my frequent co-author Tommaso Pavone from University of Toronto, which we call forbearance. So I recommend this article to you, published last year in World Politics, Where Have the Guardians Gone? Where basically what we detect in this article is a phenomenon that actually had nothing to do with democratic backsliding or rule of law crises, and actually predated them, but then which intersected with them. So let me just briefly summarize what that article is about and why it's relevant. The finding we start out with is that there's been a dramatic reduction in infringement proceedings brought by the European Commission since 2004. So after steadily increasing for decades, the number of infringements then plummeted so that it's down nearly 90%, the number of cases referred to the Court of Justice by 2019 compared to 2004. Okay, now I can't tell you the whole story of this paper, but to make a long story short, what we argue in that paper, and we did this based, it's not just an argument, we interviewed, on the basis of anonymity, very senior figures from multiple EU institutions who worked there over decades to kind of unravel this whole story of what happened. And basically, in a nutshell, the story is that by the early mid-2000s, the Commission was increasingly faced by a conflict between its two main roles. At least the way I teach EU institutions, I say the Commission's two main roles are that it's the engine of the integration, sole right of initiative, supposed to drive forward the integration process through proposing new laws, et cetera, but it's also the guardian of the treaties, okay? And I don't know, I had never really thought about it, I have to be honest. You kind of knew those two things, and it never really occurred to me until doing this project that those are inherently in tension. In fact, there's a reason in every national democracy worth its name that the National Prosecution Service is supposed to be somewhat independent of the government, right? And at least not supposed to take orders on prosecutions, based on political criteria, right? And yet in the EU, because of its history, because the Commission was not a government, because it was a technocratic independent body, it was never really viewed as problematic. But what we say is, over time, it became more problematic because what the Commission found was that as it was cracking down on enforcement over the years, bringing more infringements, governments, guess what? They didn't like it. They don't like getting sued. And so they would complain more and more. And Barroso, famously, after being prime minister and pals with everyone in the council, then once he became Commission president, he went to his first meeting of the council, and everyone started yelling at him about infringements. And then he comes back and says to staff, well, wait, what's going on with all these infringements? No one likes me anymore. Now, they want me to stop suing. And
which kind of infringements?
All across the board. It's not just the. We look at all infringements, our data is on all infringements, and you see basically declines in the number of infringements brought in all issue areas. And basically, our story is that the decision that was made in the mid-2000s was that when there was a tension between these two roles, the decision made at high levels in the Commission was to prioritize the role of the engine of integration over the guardian role. So they basically said, we're going to take a more relaxed approach to enforcement, less infringements, we'll channel everything through EU pilot and these kind of softer initiatives, and then that will win back support from member states. And they were worried about rising Euroscepticism. They had good reasons to worry about this. And in fact, the strategy worked. Basically, the member states were happy about this and became more supportive of the Commission's agenda. Anyway, I can't tell you more about this story. That's a whole nother lecture. But this led to this big decline and a relaxation in the approach to enforcement and a desire to prioritize dialogue and accommodation, et cetera, over strict enforcement of the law. But the problem is that then that tendency, which of course predates Orban, predates Kaczynski in power in Poland, that was badly timed with respect to democratic backsliding, because that all started in the mid-2000s. It kind of got really fully in place by around 2008-9, and then a year later, Orban comes to power. And so then what happens is forbearance as a style of enforcement meets up with the rule of law crisis, and the timing proves terrible, because basically this then leads the Commission to have real foot dragging in terms of bringing rule of law infringements. So you see, basically it was kind of taken out of the hands of the lawyers and put in the hands of the Secretariat General and the college. And so they have to wait till the Court of Justice, will get there, but eventually pushes them that you can actually bring these kind of infringements, because they were resisting. There was a focus on these kind of dialogue-based tools in rule of law arena. I'll say something about those in a second. And a real reluctance to use financial tools, okay? And you might be saying, oh, but no, the financial tools were only created in 2020. Not true. Not true, okay? That's the interesting part of my talk. We'll get to that. Okay, so foot dragging on infringements. If you look in the decade of backsliding, 2010 to 21, right? Only 10 infringements had anything to do with rule of law out of like the 600 they brought. It's not a lot. So they were just not, and by the way, when they reduced infringements in the mid-2000s, they said, we're going to reduce the number because we're going to bring the most important ones. Absolutely no evidence that they were bringing more, important infringements, right? And in fact, in this kind of issue, which is very systemic, right, in rule of law, there was nothing happening. Yeah, and then, some of us, Kim Scheppele and I, we wrote back in 2018, why don't they use the Common Provisions Regulation to suspend funds? Israel Butler from European Civil Liberties Union wrote a piece, same thing, same time. A lot of people thought we were crazy. You'll see in a minute we weren't. But there was a reluctance. People said, no, you can't use things like the Common Provisions Regulation, which regulates structural funds, to withhold funds on these kind of grounds. Okay, fourth factor. What my co-author Tommaso Pavoni, he has a terrific article with Cassie Emmons in a special issue of JEP where they talk about what they call the rhetoric of inaction. Here they're borrowing the language from Hirschman. Basically most good ideas in social sciences come from Hirschman, one way or another. Anyway, but he had a terrific book called The Rhetoric of Reaction, which is actually about kind of reactions to democracy as well by kind of authoritarian forces. But anyway, where he says opponents of kind of progressive reform, they regularly deploy these three sort of sets of rhetorics to shoot down efforts of people to stand up for democracy, promote those values. They have a jeopardy rhetoric, which is, oh, you could do that, but it's risky. It might create big problems. It might jeopardize the project, that sort of thing. To perversity. It could backfire. It could actually help the autocrats, right? It could have the opposite effect of what's intended, that sort of thing. Or futility, just you don't have the real tools, you can't do anything about it, you're powerless, you must accept it. And I won't go over all this, but basically they make, I think, a very convincing case there that these rhetorics came to be very dominant among EU leaders in different forms. They have lots of evidence of that. And this kind of more side of the political culture or the rhetoric at the time in the 2010s was also contributing to this reluctance to act, and instead really led the EU to focus, in particular because of this kind of rhetoric of futility, or we don't have the right tools, to say, okay, we can't do anything now, but we need to focus on creating new tools. So this is subject of another paper I did a year ago where I borrowed this idea from my friend Laurent Pech, who I think has been involved in Red Spinel too, where he says, the EU for years was engaged in what he called a new instrument creation cycle, where rather than standing up to backsliding, EU leaders were focused on saying, the problem is we don't have the right toolkit, so just give us a few years to create some tools, pass some new legislation, and then we'll have the appropriate tools we need. And so it was that was always the reaction to the latest shocking move by one of these regimes, is we need new tools. Okay, so that was going on, and that led to this kind of proliferation of unused tools. Right? I gave a talk about this last year, the rule of law Rube Goldberg machine. There's an article on that in Journal of European Integration, where basically they created a lot of tools: annual rule of law reports, justice scoreboards, annual rule of law dialogue, rule of law framework. Of course, you could use infringements, conditionality, and then the famous dead letter Article 7, right? And there's more. I get bored listing them eventually, but there was tons of these, okay? But yet, no impact, right? And some of them not even used, and the ones that were used, pretty weak. All right, so now the second part of the talk, and then I'm going to speed up because I'll try to finish in about 15 minutes or so. Okay, so that's the story of a decade of passivity. But what changed in the last couple of years? Well, the pillars start eroding. I don't know where that picture is from. I just grabbed it from the internet, but that is what half the bridges in Philadelphia, where I live, look like, okay? So, drive at your own caution. Anyway, okay, so what changed? Well, go back to those factors I just mentioned. A number of them changed in important ways. And again, it's all in the paper. I'm not going to go in detail, but there was the Fidesz-EPP divorce. That's a dramatic story. It took years of repeated red lines. If you do this, that'll be the last straw. Okay, again and again it wasn't, but finally it was. And finally, the EPP was moving, in particular because some member parties were thinking that their association with Fidesz was starting to look bad for them with some of their voters. There was movement within the party among national member parties, some of them to do something, and Fidesz finally jumped before they could be pushed, okay? And they've been in the wilderness since then without a Euro party. So that's in that's in March, April, when they leave in 2021. And then by the end of the year, earlier in the year, Merkel announces she'll be leaving. She steps down. You have a new German government come in, the Traffic Light Coalition, which includes the Greens, and they make it explicit part of their coalition pact that they're going to be tougher on the rule of law. So it's a strong signal of change. So Orban has lost his party protection, but he's also lost, the leader of Europe as a kind of defender, and instead the most powerful member state in the EU is signaling, that it wants a tougher stand. So that's all by the end of 2021. The other thing that happened in 2021 is basically that the intergovernmental norms that I talked about and the forbearance, they both really relied on a kind of reciprocity. There was a kind of understanding that, okay, we won't crack down on you too much, or with forbearance, we will relax enforcement, but then you have to play along and support our policy agenda, be a constructive player in the system. But by this year, it started becoming clear that Hungary and Poland were breaking their end of the bargain, right? They were no longer at all being constructive member states in working with others in the council. And so with them breaking their end of the bargain, eventually some member states became fed up and wanted to sort of revoke the going easy. What do I mean? Well, for instance, in summer of 2022, one of the big steps, basically Orban ran out of migrants to demonize because there were no more refugees in Hungary, so he decided to go after the LGBTQ community. But that was a bad move because EU leaders actually care about the LGBTQ community in ways they don't care about refugees, right? So whereas attacking refugees worked for him pretty well, this really backfired. And there was a famous council meeting in June 2022 when Xavier Bettel got up and yelled at him, and others all sided with Bettel, and really that was a kind of step too far. And then in Poland, again, they were pushing things further and further with Poland's quote unquote constitutional court, because it's not a real court, but this people masquerading as judges in Poland said that they rejected the primacy of EU law. Kuhn Lennertz came out and said this is a fundamental threat to the EU. The Commission immediately issued a statement, this is unacceptable. So they were pushing things further and further. And this finally prompted a kind of majority in the council to want some action, some reaction. The other thing I think was happening by this time was really the EU leaders were running out of excuses. Remember that kind of cycle I talked about where they'd always say, oh, we need new tools. But by 2022, they sort of had all the tools, and I'll get to that in a second. And they all the kind of excuses for delay in action started becoming more stale. Okay, what do I mean? Well, first of all, by this time, the rule of law conditionality regulation was in force. It had been passed in 2020, but then the Commission said, oh, okay, we have to wait for the annulment actions brought by Hungary and Poland against it to be judged. By the way, that's actually illegal of the Commission. You're not allowed to suspend the application of a directive because of a pending annulment action, but okay, we'll forgive them. So that, wasted another year and a half or so. But anyway, by February 2022, the ECJ had ruled that the annulment actions were not supported, so it was a valid regulation. And then also, by that time, a series of rulings were starting to come out in 2022 saying the EU did have a basis to act on the basis of Article 2, Article 19, et cetera, to defend rule of law norms, judicial independence. So any kind of questions about, oh, well, maybe we don't have the legal basis to take action, they weren't credible, those excuses. So, okay, they were running out of excuses. So then finally the EU acts, springs into action, really, 2022. So I think when we see more going. And I won't go through all of it now, but the actions, there were also a lot of infringements brought. I'm not going to talk so much about those. I'm going to focus on the money in the limited time I have left. But they did bring a number of infringement actions on things like judicial independence in Poland, the LGBTQ law in Hungary, et cetera. They were bringing more Article 2 related infringements. But then let's focus on the money. They finally triggered in April the rule of law conditionality regulation against Hungary. They didn't against Poland. I'll come back to Poland in a minute. And then the Commission triggered it, and then by December 2022, the Council had voted to approve the suspension of some funds under this rule of law conditionality regulation. So that was a huge step. This is a Rubicon crossed, finally this tool being used. But then this is maybe the trickier point, and we'll talk about this in Q&A, but I think it's something I've been wrestling with to really understand what happened. Because 6.3 billion were suspended under the rule of law conditionality regulation. Okay? But then something else happened, which is that other money was suspended using different tools. So first, the COVID recovery funds were withheld on rule of law grounds, which were attached to what's called the country-specific recommendations that are mostly about like macroeconomic policy, and no one paid attention. Everybody was paying attention to the rule of law conditionality regulation. Would it be passed? And myself too, I was involved in that, and plead guilty. I wasn't paying attention to anything else. But yet, once the rule of law conditionality regulation was triggered, then the Commission also withheld this COVID funds, that's 5.8 billion. Then even more surprisingly, they also used the Common Provisions Regulation, specifically Article 9, right, which has these horizontal enabling conditions, one of which is that member states must, and the Commission must ensure that in the spending of EU structural and cohesion funds, the European Convention on Human Rights is observed. And they, on the basis of that, withheld another 16.2 billion. So note, we were all waiting, for years for the rule of law conditionality regulation, but actually most of the money is suspended using other tools. How do we make sense of that? And I'll get to Poland in a second. I think the way to make sense of it, and this goes back to that article I showed you, in 2018, I and Shepla and some others had argued that under the older version of the rule of law conditionality regulation, they also could have, this is different language, but they also would have had a decent legal basis to suspend a regulation on corruption grounds and rule of law, lack of judicial independence grounds. But I think the real issue has to do with this forbearance. The Commission was afraid to act without support of the member states. So what happens is this means a vote in the Council that you can suspend money from Hungary. So that then gives them the political cover. Okay, the member states have spoken, so now we can unleash the rest of our arsenal, which doesn't need votes in the Council. See, these two didn't need votes in the Council. They could have done them anyway, right? But once you add that political signal from the Council, then that kind of opens up the space to take these other steps. And also, it's hard not to take them because, well, you've just said that there's these fundamental, rule of law problems. So then doesn't that apply mutatis mutandis to these other pots of money? Okay, how about Poland? Suspending funds to Poland. Now that became more complicated. This is all 2022, but of course 2022, Russia launched its war of aggression against Ukraine, and Poland was the big hero at that time, taking in 2 million Ukrainian refugees, being very supportive of the EU's stance, its desire to impose sanctions on Russia, et cetera. And so then my position here, I agree with Carlos Closa and others, written that the EU basically didn't want to suspend money from Poland. And what's the evidence for that? First, they very controversially, the Commission approved Poland's recovery plan, right, where they didn't approve Hungary's, so they approved it, and that could have opened up 35 billion. And by the way, that was very controversial. That's what sparked 5 commissioners to issue this letter of protest against the majority decision, saying that they thought this was not legally justified to approve this. And then also the other evidence is, of course, that in April, when they opened the rule of law conditionality regulation against Hungary, they didn't trigger it against Poland, even though there was very firm legal grounds to do so, right? But they didn't. So it looks to me like because of the political situation with Ukraine, they didn't want to act. But then what happened? Okay, basically, I don't know what the reason is, ideology, stupidity, whatever, but basically I would just say the Polish government made it impossible for the Commission to give them the money. Why? Because they continued escalating their challenge to both supremacy of EU law and to the application of the European Convention on Human Rights in Poland. So this Polish Constitutional Tribunal said that not only that EU law, primacy of EU law violated the Polish Constitution, but also said that the European Convention on Human Rights violated the Polish Constitution, right? And they just announced very openly, and the government announced, we are not going to apply these rulings from the ECHR. Okay, so that then basically tied the hands of Commission officials, because like for the recovery fund, for instance, which had been approved, right, the Polish plan, but you basically, the Commission officials in charge, they have to like sign off on a thing, tick boxes, say this member state complies with the ECHR. But there you have the government saying we don't comply with the ECHR. So they basically then have to do what they did for Hungary also, for Poland, not for the they don't trigger the rule of law conditionality regulation, but they do keep withholding the recovery fund money, and they suspend structural funds. So here, I'm not a big quantitative scholar, but let's do a little division. Okay, in total, they suspended 138 billion. Okay, so because 110 billion were suspended from Poland, about 28 Hungary. Okay, so if you do, and how much of that was rule of law conditionality? 6.3. So that's less than 5%. So in other words, 95% of the money suspended was not suspended using the rule of law conditionality regulation. How do we make sense of that? It's back to what I said. I think the political signal to act from that vote, opened the way for action. And then once they had done it for Hungary, they basically on kind of technical grounds just couldn't not do it for Poland too, since they were openly in defiance of all these requirements. Okay, so last part of my talk. 5 minutes max, and then that's all right, isn't it? Okay. Okay, where are we going? What can the trap be escaped? Of course, so we have the EU cracking down, suspending funds, bringing more infringement actions on rule of law. This is all very promising. And I have to say, as someone who's very critical and kind of pessimistic about the whole thing, I was really surprised by all those developments in 2022 and 23. It was like, wow, this is real action. Maybe I was too tough, in my criticism. And then, of course, there's the Polish election, which is this, surprising for many, great outcome. I was surprised there too. But the Democratic opposition wins. You have very obviously pro-European new leadership with the former council president. So does this mean that this problem can be swept behind us? Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think so, and here's why. First, go back. These are structural problems. These intergovernmental norms and institutions that I described at the beginning of the talk, they're all still in place. None of that has changed, right? And we saw that manifest in December, right, where once again Orban is deploying his veto over EU foreign policy and enlargement to say, well, if you don't release my money that you're withholding, right, I'm going to veto the opening of accession talks with Ukraine. And as you all know, long story short, they basically give him 10.2 billion. Okay, we can talk about it. They tried to come up with some legal justification, which I don't think anyone serious really accepts. But basically they said, okay, we'll give him $10.2 billion. He'll drop the veto over opening enlargement talks. But then he did maintain the veto, at least for a month temporarily, on the funding, right? So they had to come back in January. But the bigger point is this, right? That what that really showed, even though you might say, okay, but now they got the money for Ukraine, but this structural problem is there still. The veto power, the unanimity requirement means that whether it's Orban or the next autocrat to come along, backsliding governments have huge leverage to try to extort. People say blackmail, but it's not actually blackmail, because blackmail is when like someone knows some bad thing about you and has pictures. It's actually just extortion, right? So these governments have power to extort the EU to get their money, right? And there will be many more chances in the future, in foreign policy budgets. It'll keep coming, okay? So that hasn't changed. And I mean, remember I talked about the power to infiltrate the union? Well, you have no more powerful example than who's going to be holding the council presidency, right? The rotating presidency? Hungary. There's your next leader. And member state, there was a push from John Marine and some other friends of mine pushing ideas about, well, maybe we could sort of block them from holding the presidency, but no support for that in the council that I've heard of. So, and from that perch, he'll be in a good position again to wield influence. Because remember, the problem with autocrats, like this is like my favorite treaty article, by the way. I love Article 2, but Article 50 is the best, right? Because it just says, if you don't like it, leave. Right? And, whereas the Brexiteers, they may have been crazy, but at least they had the decency to just leave. But these autocrats, they don't want to leave. They want to stay and transform the union from within, and that's the problem, right? Okay, almost done. Next reason, party politics, what I was talking about before. There are some, let me acknowledge, there are some hopeful signs. Party politics is developing in some promising ways. The fact that right after the Slovak election, that Fico and his smear party were ejected from the PES, like the next day after they announced they were going to make a coalition government with a far-right party. That's very promising. That shows that Euro parties are maybe becoming less reluctant to shelter these kind of, and by the way, Fico is a kind of aspiring autocrat of his own right, but it shows that maybe some Euro parties are becoming less willing to tolerate it. They're worried about reputational effects. That's an encouraging sign. The fact that the Commission and von der Leyen got grilled so heavily in the European Parliament after releasing the 10.2 billion, right? That's also encouraging, just showing that there's a lot of more political pressure on these issues. One more encouraging sign, I have another recent paper just out, again in JEP. I guess I keep publishing in Journal of European Public Policy. We actually did an experiment with my colleagues Slapin, Fenzel, and Rieger. Long story short, what we found there is a kind of survey experiment, and what we found is that although voters have very little knowledge of Euro parties and they don't even know which Euro party their party is a member of, much less who the other members are, but we found that once you tell them, right, what like your party, your national party that you vote for at home is in a Euro party with like an extremist radical party, they don't like that. Right? And they react very negatively. So that's encouraging because it kind of suggests as awareness increases, right, there's maybe hope that voters will put pressure, more like what happened with PES and smear, that there'll be pressure to not allow these kind of dirty alliances at the EU level. And that might improve things. But in a bigger sense, I think, this is my most disturbing slide, I promise, I've used it before. I still think the basic problem with party politics at the EU level remains that it's, when I say it's half-baked, and it's not like, some things are nice when they're half-baked, like a molten chocolate cake, but I say, Euro party politics is more like a half-baked chicken sandwich, which is poisonous, because it's half-baked in the sense that there's very little incentive or even legal opportunity for Euro parties to kind of crack down on these problematic members. I posed a question in our session we had earlier. Why is ECR a legally registered party still, the European Conservatives and Reformists? Because they have PIS as a member. And it's supposed to be that if you're a Euro party, you as your Euro party and therefore your members are supposed to uphold common European values and the European Convention on Human Rights. But they obviously don't if they had PIS as a member. But the point is, there's very little sort of pressure from Euro parties on their members to clean house and to remain democratic. And as a result, I think national aspiring autocrats, if they get in power, they can kind of create a boundary. There's great work by Ed Gibson about local authoritarian enclaves. He says the key is the local autocrat wants to keep a boundary where he can rule with a firm hand within and keep outside forces out. And Euro parties can't do anything to help the local opposition in places where an autocrat gets in power. It's illegal to even give them money, right? So that still remains the case. And the last two things, I'll be done in 1 minute, is looking forward, we've all seen the polls about the upcoming European Parliament election. It looks bad. It looks like a lot of radical right and more autocratic forces are going to gain seats. ECR might become the third biggest party. We'll see what happens. Identity party may also gain. So it looks like the European Parliament in the future may not be as strong of a bulwark resisting these pressures as it has been if the composition changes. And I really want to end with this last couple thoughts is that I've talked mostly about Hungary, a bit about Poland, but in a way, we need to get away from that. Orban could be gone tomorrow. These are structural problems. There'll be another Orban later. Who will it be? Will it be Fico? Will it be Meloni, who's doing her own constitutional reforms, which are very scary sounding, even though she tries to present herself a bit moderate? And so the fundamentals haven't changed, and there'll be someone else down the line. And I'm also afraid going forward that a kind of new rhetoric of inaction, a new version of this will take place. And I think I saw hints of this at the January meeting where Macron was very proudly proclaiming how see, we got Orban to approve the money for Ukraine because it's important not to isolate him, but to work with him. And I'm afraid that they'll come up with kind of rhetoric like this going forward. We tried suspending funds, but, it didn't really work, right? Did he change in the past year since we suspended funds? No. So basically, the lesson is the only way to change things is at the ballot box, like what they did in Poland, right? And so let's stop suspending funds. And let's let Hungarians work this out themselves. I think that would be very dangerous for the EU because sometimes a system gets so entrenched that voters can't get rid of the leader. That's when it's truly autocratic. And I'm afraid that's the situation, and that they may steal defeat out of the jaws of victory, so to speak, because fund conditionality is powerful, but I'm afraid they might give up on it in the coming months. So yeah, just to end, I end with a biblical quote. I think the problem is that in the early days when the EU could have acted and really stopped this problem, they didn't act. And as says in Hosea 8:7, when they sow wind, means when you do nothing, when you are lazy or inactive or don't address real problems, then eventually you reap the whirlwind. Thanks.